Was Bobby Kennedy shot by a lone gunman, or was he the victim of a wider conspiracy? Well, the book Who Killed Bobby makes a stunning case that will alter the way the public views Bobby Kennedy's death.
Filmmaker Shane O'Sullivan, who wrote the book and made the documentary RFK Must Die, joins us now. But first, let's take a brief look at what happened on that fateful day in 1968.
We can start to work together. We are a great country, and a selfish country, and a compassionate country. And I intend to make that my basis for running and over the period of the next year. Mayor Yorty has just sent me a message that we've been here too long already. So, my thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you.
Moments later, he was assassinated.
Senator Kennedy has been shot in the head. I am right here. Rafer Johnson has a hold of a man who apparently has fired the shot. He still has the gun. The gun is pointed at me at this moment. I hope they can get the gun out of his hand. Get the gun. Get the gun. His hand is frozen. Get his thumb. Get his thumb. Take a hold of his thumb and break it if you have to.
It's actually quite upsetting watching that footage, isn't it?
It is. It gets me every time, you know. It's you know, the charisma of the guy, and he was really going to change the country in '68, and then to have him taken from us like that, it's you know.
And this is what, within 2 months of Martin Luther King being shot?
Exactly, yeah. King had died, and basically Bobby Kennedy was the only white guy in the States that the black and Hispanic electorate, you know, they believed in, and he was the great white hope, and then he was, you know, eliminated.
Sorry, go ahead.
What do you think happened that night? I mean, what is the story, and what do you think happened?
Well, I mean, immediately everybody saw Sirhan firing a gun in the pantry, and they didn't see anybody else firing, so they thought, okay, it's an open and shut case, we have our assassin, and they kind of rushed to judgment in terms of, you know, nailing Sirhan and then locking him up and actually giving him the death sentence at the time that was later commuted to life, so Sirhan is still alive. But it's kind of since the assassination and since more files have come to light, it seems to indicate that, you know, particularly the ballistics just don't add up. The muzzle of Sirhan's gun was 1.5 to 5 feet in front of Kennedy, and the fatal shot came from 1 inch behind. So there's a massive discrepancy there in terms of how could Sirhan be in front of Kennedy. 2 key witnesses were actually between Kennedy and Sirhan, and yet the fatal shot came from 1 inch behind. You know, it doesn't make sense.
And there were how many bullets shot? Where I mean, there were how many reports of gunshots were there?
Well, I mean, there were some people who thought there was like firecrackers or balloons popping, but they you know, certain witnesses heard so many shots they thought there must have been a second shooter, but they couldn't see it as a second shooter. But obviously, if there was a gunman behind Bobby Kennedy, an inch away with a gun cocked upwards, which is what the trajectory tells us, that would be masked by their body. And there would be no way of actually seeing them in a very crowded pantry. So now there's a new audio recording of the shooting that's been unearthed, basically the only known recording of the shooting. And that's been carefully analysed by an expert in Tucson who I just interviewed the other week. And he's concluded there are 13 shots in that recording.
And it's two different guns, isn't it?
And 2 different guns. So Sirhan's gun held 8 bullets. And so he's concluded 8 bullets from Sirhan's gun in front of Kennedy and 5 bullets from behind Kennedy from this mysterious second gunman.
Kennedy wasn't the only person who was shot on the day either.
No, I mean, there's always been a sense that there were more than 8 shots shot in that pantry because basically Kennedy was shot 3 times. Another bullet went through the shoulder pad of his coat, and then 5 bystanders were injured. And there were multiple bullet holes in the pantry as well. So it always, you know, was a question of how could Sirhan's gun inflict all that damage. It seemed like we were beyond an envelope of what 8 bullets could do, you know. So this audio recording seems to finally make sense of all that. And, you know, that's why it's quite exciting now that we've quite a strong case going forward, I think.
Did they believe that Sirhan was hypnotized when he did it? It's very interesting what the theory is.
Yeah, I mean, you know, obviously a lot of people will see the Manchurian Candidate, the original film or the update with Denzel Washington and stuff. But, I mean, this is based on fact. I mean, the U.S. Congress in the 70s investigated CIA dirty tricks in the 50s and 60s when, you know, a lot of their operations were out of control. And they found out that a man named Richard Helms in the early 50s had actually started these mind control experiments. One of the main programs was to create a hypnotically programmed assassin, a Manchurian Candidate. And by 1968, Richard Helms was the director of the CIA. He was a major enemy of Bobby Kennedy. They'd clashed earlier after the Bay of Pigs when Bobby Kennedy was Attorney General in the JFK administration. And basically, he probably would have lost his job and the CIA would have been decimated if Bobby Kennedy had attained power. So he's always been a very interesting character for me in terms of having a personal motivation and also a strategic motivation in terms of stopping a Kennedy presidency. Because, of course, Kennedy would have pulled out of Vietnam, you know, stop the defense spending, et cetera, similar to the Bush-Iraq kind of stuff. So there were major reasons why, you know, they feared a Bobby Kennedy White House. Plus, he was so close to King and the Black and Hispanic, you know, he would have really challenged the establishment.
Well, when you consider that the two biggest private armies in the US would have been the CIA and the FBI, and Kennedy had directly come into conflict with both Hoover and Helms.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as conspiracy theories go, there's an awful lot of evidence to back it up. Tell us about the girl in the polka dot dress.
She's very interesting because there was a girl in the polka dot dress seen with Sirhan in the pantry just before Kennedy came into the pantry. So he'd made his victory speech and then he came into the pantry and was walking through. And Sirhan he's just a short little guy. He was a failed jockey, so he was 5'2". And he was basically standing on a tray stacker, craning to see Kennedy coming through. And there was a girl in a white dress with black polka dots seen standing with him in the pantry. And they seemed to be smiling at each other, they seemed to be together. And then, of course, she disappeared, and a few minutes later she was seen running down a fire escape with a Mexican-American man in a gold sweater, shouting, we've shot him, we've shot Kennedy, by this witness called Sandra Serrano that I interviewed in the film. And it was curious because an hour after the shooting on live NBC TV in the States, Sandra Serrano, this young 20-year-old Kennedy volunteer, was interviewed, and she gave, you know, an immediate interview suggesting that there was a conspiracy. And, you know, the interviewer was kind of looking around, you know, is this a nutty Kennedy volunteer who's just hysterical or not? But actually, you know, it still rings true today what she said. And I interviewed her, I think the first interview in 38 years. And again, she's a very credible person. She's a delegate to the Democratic National Convention. And she still insists that's what she heard. And she still insists that she felt the girl was involved. But of course, she was bullied by LAPD, and they basically covered up all that kind of angle too.
Did the police not try and track down this...
They really went through the motions. I mean, there's great characters in this story as well, you know, apart from just the injustice of it. But there's a character called Enrique Hernandez, who was the police polygraph expert, which is basically a lie detector test. So they strapped this 20-year-old volunteer up to a lie detector in a you know, interrogation room with this basically bully, and he kept her in there for hours and hours. And we still have audio recordings of that session. In which basically he bullied her into a retraction after hours of putting her under the spotlight. And she broke down in tears, and he was using every manipulative tactic, you know, they might use in Abu Ghraib or whatever back then. And it's scandalous. So in the end, he got his retraction. She didn't, you know, kind of washed her hands of it, went back to Ohio to her parents' house, and you know, didn't emerge publicly for years.
You're a filmmaker who I suspect started on a project that seemed very interesting, and it turned into a crusade.
Yeah, I mean, the passion comes out when I talk about it, you know. Yeah, I mean, basically, I was a screenwriter, and I was looking for a story, and this is a fantastic story, you know, all these different elements. But the more I looked at the possible ending to the story, I didn't believe the official version that Sirhan did alone. So I had to find an ending, so I'd need to do my research. And the more I researched, I just thought, you know, this is ridiculous. The original investigation, the original trial, it was just a complete sham. So yeah, it became a bit more of a crusade in terms of, you know, the assassin is still alive. He's still in prison in California. For 40 years, he hasn't been able to remember the shooting. And there's still time to, you know, find out what really happened.
Well, it's extraordinary. I mean, it will have an amazing resonance at the moment because, of course, I mean, a lot of politicians, American politicians, wanted to be compared to John, but Obama has been compared to Robert. So there's huge resonances there. When is the documentary available?
Yeah, when's it on?
So it's out on DVD now, and I think Network 2 screened it a couple of weeks ago, so it should be on again there, and then the book is available now as well. So, yeah, I mean, I think it lays out the whole case so people can make up their mind.
Good work, Shane.
Great.
Congratulations.
Thanks so much.